me welcome all of you to today's Spark mini talks from the Davis Center. This is the first and what I kind of hope will become an annual tradition of an event that really is meant to bring together a cross-section of the diverse Davis Center community that includes faculty, staff, students, visiting scholars, Davis Center associates, discussing a wide variety of topics, as you'll hear today. So we're very lucky with the people who have volunteered their time to be with us to share their research. And I'm really glad that instead of just coming together for a glass of wine and some hummus, which we will also do a little bit later, that we're really going to come together today to talk about research, to talk about the various projects that are animating the intellectual life of the Davis Center community. So the way that this is going to work is that each speaker has 7 minutes to tell you a real nugget of real interest of their research, to do it as briefly and concisely and with as much interest as possible. After each person has their 7 minutes, we will take 2 questions from the audience, if there are 2 questions for our speaker, before moving on to the next speaker. After our first 4 speakers, we'll have a brief 10-minute break. We can all stretch our legs, and then we'll come back for panel 2 for our last 5 speakers. And then following that, we will have a reception just outside on the CGIS concourse. And so just a few moments of thanks. I just realized that I didn't introduce myself. My name is Cris Martin. I am the Interim Executive Director of the Davis Center. And I'm very grateful not only to all of the scholars who are here and who are sharing their work today, but also the Davis Center staff who have worked so hard to put the event together. I'd like to give a special shout out to Dan Epstein and to Irina Busigina, who are Davis Center community members who will be doing some additional moderation for the event tonight. And a big shout out and big thanks to Hannah Simon and to Laura Sargent for putting the event together logistically, because it all takes a lot more effort than it looks like when things go right. So many thanks to all of you. And we also were very grateful to a Davis Center associate whose donation of funds allowed this event to be possible. So we are recording the event for posterity. It will at some point be on our YouTube channel, so please just be advised that the event is being recorded. Okay. All right. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dan.
All right, thank you, Cris. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. And presenters, I am Dan Epstein. I am the Assistant Director for Scholars Without Borders at the Davis Center, also lecturer in government. And I'm so pleased to be here today for our inaugural Spark Talks as the moderator of panel 1. And since I know that time, very important today, 7 minutes and no more. And even questions. If anybody asks very long questions, expect to get a dirty look. I will proceed directly to present our first presenter, Stanislav Stanskikh, who will present on political persecution of dissent in Russia, 2022-2025. Stanislav's a Davis Center associate. He's a Russian constitutional scholar in exile. He was trained originally at the Lomonosov Moscow State University School of Law. He also is currently a research fellow for UNC Chapel Hill Center for Slavic, Eurasian, and East European Studies, as well as a visiting scholar at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. He has served in Russia before he had to flee the country as executive director of the Russian Foundation for Constitutional Reforms and the inaugural deputy editor-in-chief of the Russian Constitutional Court's Academic Law Review. So let's all have a nice round of applause to welcome Stanislav. We'll let you take it away. Why don't we get a timer start from...
I'm ready. Once he starts to speak, I'm ready. Yeah.
Okay, so my name is Stanislav Stanskikh. I will speak about political persecution of dissent in Russia in 2022-2025, a period defined by unprecedented repression in Russia and coinciding with Russia's brutal aggression abroad in Ukraine. And repression in Russia is not new. But since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, The Kremlin has weaponized, I shouldn't forget about the slides. The Kremlin has weaponized domestic law to criminalize virtually any expression of any dissent, including anti-war in Ukraine. And the numbers alone are staggering. Over 20, as you can see, over 20,000 Russians have been detained in politically motivated cases. Around 3,000 Russians face criminal charges, and as of 2024, approximately 1,500 Russians are being imprisoned. Most are already serving their sentence, and the average sentence in anti-war and politically motivated criminal cases now exceeds 6 years. And the acquittal rate in the Russian courts is practically non-existent. It's just 0.33%, which is less than 1% of, we're talking only about criminal cases. And so now Russians live in the country where fear and intimidation are a state policy. Independent media, pretty much all independent media were shut down. Peaceful opposition voices have been silenced, exiled, or murdered. Dissenters are routinely tortured, and new snitch culture has taken root, encouraged by the state. Let me move to the next slide. So I have some political caricature comparing Putin and Stalin, Joseph Stalin. So the forms of forms of political persecution range from criminal charges to forced psychiatric treatment. Dissenters also are being drafted into the army as a punishment for their political activities. Some have lost their parental rights. Others have been poisoned, attacked, or smeared. It is a system designed not only to punish individuals, but to send a message to society. Any resistance is dangerous and will be punished. And probably let me see if I don't have it in this presentation. Probably you heard many outrageous cases where Russians being prosecuted for just a like on Facebook, on social media accounts, or by saying war instead of a special military operation, or by saying a joke or anecdote about the Russian armed forces. Even telling your doctor or talking to your doctor in a confidential manner, or to your attorney, can lead potentially to criminal charges. I'm not even talking about donating to Navalny's organizations, which were recognized by the Russian authorities as undesirable and extremist organizations, or Ukrainian any donation to Ukrainian charities are punishable by the Russian Criminal Code. And now the Russian Criminal Code, I just listed some of the political articles of the Russia's Criminal Code, but it's pretty much a dozen of new. The authorities implemented a dozen of new articles, political articles, into the Russian Criminal Code, and you can be jailed for up to 15 years in prison for spreading fake news, so-called fake news, about the Russian army, for discrediting Russia's armed forces again, up to 6 years for the involvement into the activities of extremist organization or undesirable organization. Even the word itself, Navalny, now being criminalized because Alexei Navalny was recognized by extremists, and the head of just 1 minute. I am okay. Okay, so a quick compare Stalin's and Putin's repression. So unlike Stalin's terror, today's repression is selective and digital. It targets individuals, but in a way that makes everyone feel vulnerable. Surveillance, censorship, and economic coercion have replaced mass executions, but the fear no less real. And the repression doesn't stop the Russian borders. The Kremlin actively doing surveillance of activists abroad, monitoring their social media accounts, and even abusing Interpol participation in the protest rallies. For example, in a protest, in any protest rallies in the United States can lead to the criminal charges in case of return to Russia. And okay, so what lies ahead? More repression, harsher sentences, and further erosion of due process. The Kremlin's goal is to make resistance invisible, exile irrelevant, and protest impossible.
Thank you. All right. So we have time for 2 questions. Any questions from the audience?
Well, I think I should go ahead. So how massive actually those, that wave of repression is? So is it something that kind of, puts Russia on par with, other repressive regimes, or are they rather limited and arbitrary, and that's the way how people are supposed to be deterred from, speaking out, from activism and so forth? So to me, it doesn't look like these are massive mass repressions, but
Systemic, you mean systemic, right?
and kind of in terms of numbers. So what's your
Right.
assessment of numbers?
So again, during the Stalin era, the nature of repression was, it was different ideological reasons of the Stalin regime, and the repressive style was different. It was mass repressions, millions of people were, persecuted. The entire ethnic groups were persecuted and stuff. Now, modern authoritarian regime, I'm not a political scientist, I'm a legal scholar. So I'm more analyzing, but as far as I know, and Sergei Guriev and other authors touch base on it, modern authoritarian regimes, especially nowadays with the internet, with Facebook and stuff, they are not repressing the big group of social group classes. They don't repress classes. The repressions are personalized, and in a way to create atmosphere of fear and intimidation. So others would know that, okay, because the internet, the social media accounts and stuff, everyone would know that they would see the picture like what we see with the Trump administration right now. They put the Trump administration ordered for ICE officers to put like a coat, and it should be like ICE. Everyone should wear coats with the ICE on it. So for what? For media picture. So other people would see it, and they would see that, okay, Trump administration is keeping his promises. So I would say that Putin's regime is no difference from other authoritarian regimes.
So we have one more question. I see Irina Busikina.
Stanislav, thank you very much. I have a complicated question.
Political scientist.
Yeah.
No.
Should I leave the room or what?
Not sure.
So, I have a complicated question to you, probably you don't know, but how decentralized are repressions? So this is, since Russia is huge and repressions are very unevenly distributed across the different Russian regions. Do the regional, so the Siloviki, so these people, do they have the figures or also the names from Moscow? Or do they work with their own kind of protesters or dissidents themselves? So how it is organized over the territory of Russia?
So few aspects about this. First of all, it's kind of conceptual that the Russia is a highly centralized country, and for example, criminal law is a federal regulation. So Siloviki, law enforcement officers, right, FSB, police, and so on and so forth, they have the same federal regulation. So in terms of you cannot, like in some countries, you cannot hide from persecution by relocating to another region. This, I mean, you can, everything possible, but this is consensual that it's pretty much impossible. And US Department of State in its reports on human rights in Russia specifically pointed out that Russia is a highly centralized country and relocation will not save you from persecution. In terms of regional specific, of course, Russia has some regional specific. North Caucasian region is the nature of repressions, the collective punishment of family members, for example, under the Ramzan Kadyrov rule, is different than in, and also the last thing, Russian authorities disproportionately mobilized ethnic minorities, Buryatia and some other regions. So
Thank you very much. Oh, yes, please make sure you're leaning into the microphone. Our next speaker, you can come up now. We're going to move along. There's the clicker there. If you click to the next slide, it should go right to your next slide. We have Yukinori Komine. His work is entitled The Northern Territory, Southern Kuril Islands in US, Japan, China, Soviet Relations. Yukinori is a Davis Center Associate. He holds a PhD in politics from Lancaster University in the United Kingdom. He's Associate Professor of International Relations and Global Security at American Public University and an Associate in Research at the Reischauer Institute, as well as the author of 2 books on US-Japan foreign relations. So with that, I will let you take it away and we will try and keep the time. So.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for attending. So my topic is about the territorial dispute between Japan and Russia, Soviet Union. 80 years passed since the end of World War II, and there is still no peace treaty between Russia and Japan. Japan's northernmost part, there are 4 islands, Etorofu, Kunashiri, and Habomai, and Shikotan. That's also Russia's far eastern part as well. This makes Japan and Russia neighbors, close neighbors. In fact, it is possible to see Russia actually from northern part of Hokkaido, Nemuro. It is about 3.7 kilometers, about 2 miles. So it is visible. So 2 countries, very close geographically speaking, but psychologically and diplomatically so far away. This makes also importantly Russia an Asian power. A lot of people talk about Western Front, NATO, Ukraine. Yes, it is important. But on the other hand, in the East, Russia is an Asian power. Its Eastern Front, Far Eastern Front is vast. Many studies have examined this problem, territorial problem, in domestic context and also in in bilateral context and domestic politics. I am examining this problem within the context of four power interaction: Russia, Japan, the United States, and China. There were two major important developments early on. 1956 joint declaration, which agreed upon the transfer of two islands, Habomai and Shikotan, after signing peace treaty with Japan. In 1973, joint statement acknowledged the existence of territorial problem as unresolved issue in bilateral relations. Russia later denied such acknowledgement. There were two important security issues. One is US-Japan relations, and then the other one is Japan-China diplomatic relations. The existence of US bases in Japan, and then the possibility of applying US-Japan security treaty to northern territories upon their transfer to Japan, that made a long-term serious concern for Russia.
That was the last slide.
Yeah.
Okay. So I had several other slides, so let me just continue. In 1972, Japan and then China had diplomatic normalization. And then 1972, also US and then China had rapprochement. And that made a triangular relationship among the US, China, and then Japan. Moscow felt encircled. And then that resulted in a series of endeavors on the part of Moscow to break this encirclement. And it was the outbreak of Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 that did freeze territorial peace talks with Tokyo. From 1985 until 2021, there was some bilateral negotiations, the resumption of bilateral negotiations without substantial progress. And it was the February 2022 outbreak of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine that did freeze territorial talks again. And therefore, there are two blocks, basically, Japan, US, and then now Russia becoming close to China. So we can think about Ukraine situation in the West, but also US, Japan, and then a Northern Territory issue in the East. These two are linked. And therefore, the territorial issue became entrapped. And that's why I titled this talk as Trapped. And then for future possible options, it is very difficult under current leadership. And therefore, strategic patience is what I suggest. And then until the emergence of new leaders and different internal and external environments. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. So again, we have time for two questions. See one from Kelly.
How would you say that Japan's interests or relations toward Russia have changed over, you pick the time period?
Okay,
Yeah.
yes. So earlier on, it was mostly about the territorial problem. Territory first, without territory, no peace talks. But later on, during the latter part of Soviet era and the early part of Russia, when the Soviet Union and Moscow went through a series of economic difficulties, there was some interest in providing some technological techniques, information, and sharing those things. And then tourism and then visa-free visit also took place as well. So there was sort of informal cultural exchanges, those things also took place. But the territorial issue remained as a core of a bilateral relationship. It is a clash of nationalism, national identities. So that makes bilateral relationship very difficult, although people-to-people relationship does exist. Thank you for your question.
See another question. Cris?
Can you talk a little bit about what it's hard to have expectations of Donald Trump because he tends to take people by surprise. And he also tends to undermine what were previously held alliances. Is there any sense of what a Trump presidency might mean to a Japan-US alliance and therefore potentially an impact on this particular situation?
Thank you for your question and comment. It seems that Japan is one of those countries which has been doing relatively well with the United States under current sitting president. It was done firstly by a former late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who did the sort of golf diplomacy, playing golf, a lot of golf, organizing a lot of golf events. And that became a very good personal basis of understanding between the two leaders. And then current Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba also did something similar. Not yet extended golf practice, but a lot of flattering and then direct personal talks. No talking point beyond the 1 page. And then make it simple, less means more. And then they did go along well in earlier summit meeting this year. So it is possible that it is not going to be as intense as other bilateral relations with all of US allies. Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, thank you. And our next speaker is Mikhail Troitskiy. Mikhail's talk is How Do Autocrats Survive Foreign Policy Disasters? He's a Davis Center visiting scholar, also visiting professor at the Tufts Fletcher School. He's previously served as professor of practice in Russian studies at University of Wisconsin-Madison. Before having to flee Russia in 2022, he taught at the European University of St. Petersburg and MGIMO in Moscow. So Mikhail, please take it away.
Thank you very much. I'm just sitting up. Okay, so thank you all for coming. How long can autocrats survive foreign policy disasters? So to begin with, political scientist Daniel Cheesman, a prominent one indeed, once explored the causes of the downfall of autocratic regimes. And he found that in many cases, actually, historically, the autocrat was ousted because of an unforced mistake. And in particular, quite a few dictators, according to Cheesman, fell after making a major mistake in foreign policy and then failing to accommodate members of the electorate of their ruling coalition, compensate their domestic allies for the losses and other inconvenience. And here at the Davis Center, it's natural to look at Russia. And when it comes to Russia, we never had a shortage of forecasts of an imminent collapse of the Putin regime. So, for example, right here, a Rutgers University professor predicts the downfall of the Putin regime in the aftermath of the annexation of Crimea. And here, a prominent Norwegian political scientist, Ivar Neumann, predicts the same several months into Russia's full-scale war with Ukraine. Now, but what if the autocrat is really smart enough and ready to address both public and elite problems and discontent in the wake of a foreign policy disaster? So what an autocrat can do, a smart autocrat can do, is shore up propaganda to maintain public support. And he also, a smart autocrat, also eliminates major sources of concern for the public. So the news article pictured here reports an abrupt end to civilian mobilization in Moscow for the war with Ukraine in the fall of 2022. So tensions were running so high after mobilization began that the Moscow mayor just decided to stop it in Moscow less than 1 month after its launch without authorization from the Russian Ministry of Defense. And of course, a smart autocrat, Vladimir Putin here, took good care of co-opting members of his ruling coalition. So right here in February 2022, he discusses on the record with top government officials the idea to launch a full-scale invasion of Ukraine a few days before the war started. So by televising this session later on, Putin bounded the elites and the ruling group publicly to his decision. And then on the day of the invasion in the afternoon, Putin assembled top Russian businessmen and executives and reassured them that he had no intention to expand the war beyond Ukraine and that he also had no intention to isolate Russia from the world economy. And so by doing this, he also ensured the dependence of these groups on himself, because sanctions would soon target these guys for as Putin's cronies. And in this picture, the CEOs of Gazprom Neft and Gazprom are hiding their faces behind masks because they realize that anyone present in this meeting would certainly be sanctioned by the West. So during crisis like Prigozhin mutiny in June 2023, pictured here, Putin carefully navigated internal conflicts in Russia. So he prioritized negotiation and compromise over brutal crackdowns. That was the way he untangled the Prigozhin mutiny. Now, but the question is, how long even smart autocrats can keep going after they face disaster abroad? And so the problem, and these are AI generated images, if anyone is concerned. The problem for autocrats who pick up fights abroad is that even if they initially succeed in containing the domestic political fallout, time is not on their side. So prolonged conflicts deepen internal divisions. And in most cases, those are divisions between hawks who want to fight until victory and pragmatists who are inclined to take off-ramps and negotiate some kind of a compromise. And then this leads to internal polarization that in turn leads to a decision-making paralysis, and then often to regime collapse, or at least to the ouster of the leader who was responsible for initiating the conflict. Now, here's one textbook case, and we won't have time for more than one. So Argentina seizes the Falkland Islands in April 1982, then Britain regroups and strikes back, and that gets this gentleman, General Leopoldo Galtieri, the junta leader, in hot water. He is unable to adjudicate between bureaucrat pragmatists and the military. So the first group wants a compromise, the second group, the military, want to fight. And so Galtieri ends up resigning, and then within months, the junta falls, and here it is on trial already in 1985. So to conclude, hawks usually tell the leader, if you go soft, you are done. You are toast and will all go under. And they are ironically right. They often ironically prove right. If the leader goes soft, he is eventually ousted. So typically, ending prolonged wars demands a new leadership capable of credible negotiations. And that means that those autocrats that start wars rarely survive politically to negotiate their end. Thank you.
All right, let's see. One question. I want to see if anybody hasn't had a chance to ask a question. Okay, well, Irina, then
Because this is
oh,
from political scientist to political scientist. And not to constitutional, constitutional. Misha.
We'll keep it constitutional.
Never. I cannot. I would love to. Misha, the question to you, it's all very interesting, but I was thinking myself a lot. How can you conceptualize mistake? What is a mistake? What is a mistake? Is it something? I will try to be as brief as possible. But is it something kind of objective, or it is something that Putin could have made and not be able to present it as success? Is it mistake? Because with launching the war, it's difficult to rationalize Putin's foreign policy. But with launching this war, the people say, "Oh, this was a mistake." However, there are other things that he achieved through this kind of mistake, like the import substitution, the rise of the Far East, better relationship to China, all these things. So, what is mistake, and when we can say this was a mistake?
Well, I didn't.
can I actually add on to that? Because I have a really similar question. Maybe we could sort of concretize it more. So a lot of people would say doesn't look like a mistake to me. He's sort of winning the war. He's popular. Nobody's, once Prigozhin's gone, nobody's. What is the next thing that we could see in the next months? It would say, there's the other shoe dropping. Now we can tell it's really a mistake because this terrible thing has made it clearly a mistake when some people could argue, actually, it's all right.
Okay, in 2 seconds, nothing in my research design hinges on the assumption that Putin made a mistake. I was actually arguing Putin was a smart or has been a smart autocrat who was avoiding this trap of antagonizing elites after making a risky maneuver abroad. So for now, we are only talking about the immense risk that Putin has been taking with this prolonged war. And this is something I fail to understand, really. We can talk about that later. So Putin never used to take prolonged risks and mounting risks before in his prior life. Now he's 3 years into this war. And the risk is only going up, and he seems still to be fine, trolling Donald Trump and, with all this ongoing war. So, but conceptualizing the mistake, that's the work that was done by Dan Giesman. So he has in his paper a very clear explanation what he considers to be an unforced mistake. And basically he says there were other options available and even discussed, and yet the autocrat did something different. To your question, then I think, the risk is mounting, and you can see, things popping up here and there, including this very situation with, elites. And I think we are already in this situation with the schism kind of deepening between those who want, off-ramps, and they are being tempted by what Donald Trump is saying. In that way, Donald Trump is clearly destabilizing the regime, despite, the regime kind of looking solid and, and trolling him in response. He destabilizes them because there's a group that definitely wants to take this off-ramp. And there's some reason why it's not being taken up until now. And that if that builds up with time, I would not be surprised if we'll see, something like that in the foreseeable future.
Thank you. I think we have one other question. Nargis has a chance for a question too.
But opening a war and going soft, it's not the same thing. One doesn't make automatically to the other. Why can't you stop over war and having a militarized economy and like be super, passion and accidents and all that? So sort of North Korea style, like why kind of imagine.
Yeah, North Korea, by the way, never launched a war of choice, right? I mean, aside from 1950s, Kim Jong-il, but he was doing it on behalf of Stalin and Mao in a way, right? But after that, he was just completely protective. So the reason why he didn't have to make this choice of either going soft or hard on anyone, he has always been hard on the internal sort of enemies, opposition, preemptively. That's because he never launched an adventure abroad. Yes.
But you stop fighting, it doesn't mean that.
I mean, for the hawks, it's usually, we have only so many cases that we can talk about. And the two notable cases, the two other notable cases are related to Russia. One is the Bolshevik Revolution and the other is the war in Afghanistan. So in both cases, going soft on enemies also meant going soft on opposition, domestically, like Mr. Kerensky, the head of the provisional government, went soft on the Bolsheviks, although he had, Lav Kornilov, whom he kind of prepped to make a march on Petrograd, and that never materialized. And eventually, sort of, he was unable to adjudicate what to do with both the sort of external enemy, with Germany, and with the Soviet on the ground in Petrograd. And the same applied to Gorbachev and the Afghanistan war. So in those cases, going soft on the domestic opposition kind of came hand in hand with going soft on the enemy. But I think in the generic case, by going soft, I mean just kind of stopping the fight and looking for off-ramp. And that is something that clearly, as the cases demonstrate, let a few autocrats down so far. And it's easy to trace the process whereby they fell. That's what makes this research project particularly exciting to me. And I'm hoping to kind of combine a couple of articles into perhaps kind of expanding into a larger
Great.
sort of piece of writing. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mikhail. Our final presenter is our own at the Davis, and I say our own because Anastasiia Pereverten with her presentation, Ukrainian responses to injuries from Russian aggression, is a master's student currently in the Davis Center's RICA program. She's also a Davis Center graduate student associate. She holds degrees from Mikhail Academy, as well as the University of Wyoming. And she worked at the National Center Ukrainian House in Kyiv, as well as served as a legislative aide in the Wyoming State Legislature. And before coming to the Davis Center, worked as a researcher at New Lines Institute, a DC-based foreign policy think tank. So with that, Anastasiia, please take it away.
So I'm starting my timer not to be off time. I'm Anna, and I'll talk about Ukrainian responses to the problems caused by Russia, specifically amputations in Ukraine. So I'll say that all the pictures used in the presentations are my own. This winter break, I had a chance to visit a couple of rehabilitation centers that deal with amputations, and that's mainly what I get my information from. So the problem of amputations in Ukrainian case is complicated by a couple of things. First of all, Russian systematic attack on civilian infrastructure. So hospitals that are being overwhelmed and destroyed, but also civilians that are now suffering from amputations, not only military personnel. Then Russia's wide use of drones leads to a very high percentage of upper limb amputations. It is a very unusual type of trauma, and there isn't not enough of supply of prosthetics for that type of trauma in Ukraine right now. Another one is Russia's indiscriminate use of landmines that just leads to a higher number of amputations. Overall, we know that in 2 years, there's been almost 94,000 amputations. Now, it doesn't translate into a number of people because people unfortunately have double and triple amputations. But what also is important to mention is that the society that finds a response to it, Ukrainian society, works so tightly with Ukrainian government to try and find a response to it amidst the war, while the government needs to accumulate and mobilize all of the resources towards the defense and the fight. So the state simplifies the bureaucracy and regularly updates the cost cap for purchasing prosthetics for veterans and for civilians. At the same time, nonprofits find international fundraising opportunities to build additional capacities for rehabilitation and prosthetic installment. And here I'll talk about three specific case studies. Superhuman centers centered in Lviv and tumor centers under construction in Lviv in Dnipro. These two are being supported by French and Dutch government. What's interesting about superhumans, this entire medical center and rehabilitation capacity have been built in under 1 year during full-scale invasion already on the private initiative, not using any government funds whatsoever, entirely relying on huge international fundraising. Now, all the centers that I'm going to be talking about, they have different ranges of services they provide, ultimately trying to improve the quality of life of not only Ukrainian veterans, but also civilians who lost their limbs due to Russian attacks. So this center has a very holistic list of services, starting with medical evacuation from the front line that is direct from the front line to the center. One of the problems that I didn't mention before is the long evacuation cycle. So Russia targets medical evacuation cars, and that leads to sometimes an 8-hour-long evacuation cycles, and that results in higher amputations and dirtier amputations, which complicates rehabilitation, of course. So Superhumans works on evacuation, then it works on prosthetic purchase, prosthetic installment, rehabilitation physically and psychologically, and even things like reconstructive surgery and hearing aids and vision aids. All of that is being taken care of at Superhumans. Superhumans, because they rely on huge international fundraising, they have to also be international advocates for Ukraine. And you can see a picture from a DC trip this summer where I had an honor to accompany their congressional meetings and meetings with think tanks and journalists in DC. And they have a number of those. And it shows and goes to show you how Ukrainians who are finding responses to those very large tragic problems also have to be ambassadors of their country, also have to be searching for donorship and kind of tackling all of the issues at the same time. Titanov is a much smaller center. It's not a medical hospital. They don't procure prosthetics themselves. They rely on government funding to buy prosthetics and themselves only do physical and psychological rehabilitation. What is also fascinating, that they work with state hospitals to provide expertise and material base for rehabilitation for Ukrainian veterans who don't have access to centers as such. And they have a separate initiative for vacation. Again, you can see the car that is owned by that initiative. Last one, Prometei, the smallest center out of the ones that I'm presenting. This one in the basement of a residential building in Vinnytsia. They solely focus on physical rehabilitation and treatment of pain, specifically phantom pain. That's something that the absolute majority of veterans and civilians with amputation complain about. And you can see the application of very new technologies using AI trying to help veterans with phantom pain. I want to conclude by saying that to me, this is a story of a society that is trying to both persevere through Russian attacks and on the go find solutions to the tragedies that Russian attacks incur upon them. And evidently, while Ukrainian government and Ukrainian society are mobilizing resources for the defense and the fight, long-term foreign investment is needed to support such centers. And as I talked about private initiatives, I want to emphasize in my conclusions that while we may, as individuals, be unable to provide wartime insurance or huge investment, we can do simple things that are actually very important, such as connecting those centers to donors that you can think of, potential donors that you can think of, or donating to them directly. And here's a link for a Superhuman Center. Thank you.
All right, questions? Nancy?
Hi, thank you so much for your research. I was wondering if you think Ukraine can meet the growing demand of prosthetics given the current circumstances, and how does, foreign aid or just national aid play a role in this?
Sure. So that's one of the issues that Ukrainian Ministry of Social Policy encounters, where budgets compiled for the year for purchasing those prosthetics are not being entirely used up because of how slow the supply of those prosthetics is. Right now, Ukraine relies primarily on prosthetics from a German company named Autobach. Autobach continues to work in Russia to their disdain, and it often results in very long wait list for prosthetics, and it has a very real life implication, because the longer veteran has to wait for his prosthetic to come in, the lower are the chances this person will use that prosthetic. So people get used to not having their prosthetics. But Ukraine has a couple of its own startups that are producing prosthetics. Unfortunately, they are nowhere near meeting the demand. So one of the most famous ones with the office in Kyiv and in Berlin is Esper Bionics. They produce high functionality prosthetics for upper limbs specifically. Per year, they can make up to 300 prosthetics. You saw the number of 94,000 people with amputations in 2 years of the full-scale invasion. And that number is obviously growing with the worsening situation with air defense. This number will go up much higher very soon, unfortunately. So Ukraine needs to be building a network of suppliers outside of Autobach and domestic businesses, potentially seeking partnerships with companies from other countries, not just Autobach. Thank you.
The question? Did you? Stanislav?
Question. So Ukraine is a country with a high corruption, right? And do you know, if we compare, let's say, efficiency in terms of how much dollars or euro we're spending for one veteran for the surgery or rehabilitation cycle in non-profit, at the non-profit hospital and government funded hospital? Would it be about the same numbers, or I don't know if you know the.
So the question of inefficiency,
Right.
there is a nonprofit organization that conducts research on prosthetics and amputations in Ukraine called Protest Hub. They conduct surveys. According to their surveys from 2024, it was something like over 70% of patients reported being satisfied with the government provided services. I don't know the numbers for individual patients, but I know the numbers for how much it costs to run those different types of services. So Superhumans per year has a budget of over $26 million, not using any government funds. I know government quotas for purchasing prosthetics. The problem is that the calculations are always made in Ukrainian currency and they're purchased in euros. But for this, Ukrainian government every 2 months updates the amount of money granted to veterans. No cases of corruption are known to me in this sphere. The biggest issue that veterans have been complaining, ministry has been complaining, is the wait list for prosthetics. But at the same time, according to the surveys, the average wait time for a prosthetic is 2 months, which is not too bad. Of course, it will be cheaper to support veterans in the state-owned hospitals, but it comes at the expense of lower wages for medical staff, and also like this is a different material base. So Komine provide this entire space is actually a rented part of an old factory that used to be a producer of food supplies for outer space missions. And the factory was targeted by Russia this summer. It's been inactive for forever. They rent this space for 15 million hryvnias per year, if I'm not mistaken. It's entirely supported by Ukrainian businesses. No government money goes into the center itself. 3 times a week, they have buses coming from state-owned hospitals to conduct rehabilitation sessions because state-owned hospitals simply don't have the material base to do that. And there are right now 300 hospitals in Ukraine that they claim to be prepared for supporting veterans with amputations.
All right, thank you very much. This is the end of our first panel, and so now I believe we're going to have a little break.
Yeah. Welcome back. Thank you for still being here. And now my colleague Irina Busigina will take over the moderation for panel 2. Irina.
Cris. Thank you very much.
Welcome.
And thank you, all of you. I thank our dear audience. I'm Irina Busigina. I'm a visiting scholar at the data center currently. And I invite you all for our part 2. And the only thing I wanted to tell you that in the part 1, we were able to listen to very diverse presentations, 4 diverse presentations. But if you want to know what is real diversity, welcome to this part. Because here we're going to discuss the most diverse things from mathematics to the paranormal phenomena, the Soviet Union and beyond. So our first presenter is Eva Sułek. Eva Sułek is many things. Yeah. She's an art historian, curator, artist, writer, and also co-founder of the Leisure Art Center in Poland. She received her PhD at the Nicolaus Copernicus University in Poland, and she held the Fulbright Junior Research Award at Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. She is the DAAD Prime postdoctoral fellow at the Freie Universität in Berlin. And her current project focuses, as far as I understood, on the transformation of the art center Izolacja into illegal Russian prison and filtration camp in Donetsk. And Eva is a visiting scholar here at the Davis Center. And the title of her presentation is The War Bodies, the Geobodies, and the Gender Neutrality of War. Eva, please.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. I will just
Speak up a little bit.
Yes. I'm just. Okay. So the war in Ukraine is not gender neutral, obviously. And since the onset of the full-scale invasion, women and men have taken on distant and specific roles.
Yeah.
Oh, it's just me, I'm just silence speaker. Sorry. So amid the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine, a clear trend has emerged. Women frequently bear the responsibility for supporting their families while facing income loss, family separation, significant disruptions in essential services. In contrast, many men are involved in direct military efforts at the front lines. They are risking death, serious injuries, and mental health challenges. Although many Ukrainian women have voluntarily joined the military and territorial defense forces, the mobilization of men is deeply intertwined with the beliefs about masculinity. The gender division of labor traditionally posits men as fighters and women as nurses. I research works by contemporary Ukrainian artists to figure out whether they address the themes of gender and war. Since the issue of representation in the context of war is both urgent and long-standing, I agree with Frederick Jameson that the key point is that war constitutes something that he calls a collective reality, as it establishes circumstances that affect everyone, without exception. Therefore, I propose to look at bodies affected by war as gender-neutral war bodies and the geobodies. Since war is always an assault on the body and physicality is always connected to the war, I suggest examining these issues within the broader context of war bodies, which carry diverse meanings related to the physical suffering of individuals and their occupied land, emotional trauma, and the experience of bodies stripped of legal and political rights, bodies that have been violated. For the concept of the geobody, I rely on Swiss media artist Ursula Biemann, who suggests that the body is not just a physical entity, but is deeply intertwined with the geography, ecology, and social-political conditions of a given space. Therefore, I believe that the Ukrainian war bodies are also geobodies, shaped by their spatial context. This perspective emphasizes the idea that bodies are not isolated, but are part of a larger ecosystem and are influenced by the conditions of their surroundings, the war, that imposes on them multiple bodily circumstances such as migration, sleep deprivation, mutilation, or death. In her 2023 Acrylics on Canvas, a self-portrait with children on an Austrian train, Ukrainian artist Katerina Lisovenko, who is displaced and currently living and working in Vienna, comments on the state of migration. She chooses to give to the refugees the bodies of non-humans. She reconceptualizes othering by giving refugees the bodies of mythological satires, taking away their humanity, the way it was taken away by the invaders. Lada Nakonechna, another Ukrainian artist from Kiev, for her 2022 project entitled Study of Man, she chose to cast just one body part, a knee, which is the largest joint of the human body. As underlined by Nakonechna, that body part does not belong to anyone who exists or existed. It's just an object that can be used, displayed, or rearranged, epitomizing how humans can also be objectified in geopolitical games. Nakonechna's bodies are fragmented, objectified, depersonalized. Through very different visual methods, she represents Biemann's geobodies. I could also not dismiss the impression I sense when observing her knee joints and pipes, that what am I looking at are some kind of disfigured human prostheses. And thus I rushed to search for more of Nakonechna's current work, and soon found the Below the Ground Level, the work from 2024. 3 objects, crutches made of wood and papier-mâché, seem too fragile to become a solid buttress for the main body. This flimsiness corresponds to the perishability of the potential body that might need such underpinning. The body is missing, but at the same time, its absence represents its presence, as we can envisage the anatomy of a person in need of such a structure. And the final work of art that I want to mention today is 2023 video by Kharkiv-born artist Alina Kleitman. It was presented in Estonia, in Tartu, at the exhibition entitled Endless Shine of Human Violence, that pertains to the movie Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. And she intended to challenge the notion of forgetting trauma. The video, we see the still of the video here, is entitled The Four Revenges of Queen Olga, and introduces the character of a dirty wife, a victim and fool, who is both the perpetrator of violence and its victim. The video delves into the semi-legendary events of Queen Olga's of Kievan Rus vengeance, as described in the tale of bygone years. The video features three main elements: a woman's body painted in Russian flag colors that are placed on those parts where the marks of rape usually show. Then the second element is narrations from the bygone years chronicle. And finally, an interrupting voice of violence itself. Kleitman uses her own body that in the video represents both fertility and genesis, and her character nourishes violence, highlighting humanity actually craving for it. While referring to the biological capabilities of a female body with its birth and non-human gestures, the creature in the video remains queer, thus challenging conventional understanding. Oops. Not only of gender, but also of specimen. And since my time is gone, but I took some time to fix the microphone, I guess I can put the final sentences. So I analyzed the gender experiences and representations of war in contemporary Ukrainian art amid the ongoing conflict, with the focus on universal experience of war and gender neutrality. In conclusion, I call for the need to consider the emotional and political dimensions of war as reflected in artistic practices, advocating for a gender-sensitive approach in understanding and addressing the impacts of war on all bodies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ivan. Our two questions, please. Please.
I don't know if you'll know the answer to this, but obviously you were looking for art that was responding to the war. Do you have a sense of, in the contemporary art scene in Ukraine right now, how many people are responding to the war in their work? Or are people more likely to try and look at something else other than war because they've been living the lived experience of war for so many years? And obviously you're not in Ukraine, but I didn't know if you knew something about that.
Yeah, this is actually something that I was looking at because in my previous research project, I was looking at art after the Maidan and after the annexation of Crimea and the beginning of the war in Donbass. And actually back then, I've noticed that it does not comment on the events directly that much, that it rather tries to like delve into the like bigger problems that would lead to these events. And these days it's the other way around. So it actually, the majority of contemporary artists are really focused on like what is happening here and now.
Thank you very much. Kelly, please.
It's really interesting listening to your talk on having just heard Anastasiia. So, and just all kinds of really interesting ideas about the body and its representation and absence. And I'm just wondering if you, both with Anastasia's talk and yours, I'm wondering if you have plugged this artwork into a more global kind of context of artistic wrangling with the experience of warfare. It's enough just to talk about it within the Ukrainian context, but I'm wondering if there are connections and conversations going on among artists in Ukraine with other war-torn areas.
I would say that for now, my focus is Ukrainian art, and I kind of feel that it's important for Ukrainian artists to focus solely on them, like thinking about the colonization of Ukrainian studies and of the field and of the fact that like not enough focus was placed on that before. Then as much as it's obviously, I think it will be important to try to find like its place and to understand it better in the global context. I think that maybe for now it's good to only focus on, well, this is my chair saying like that. For now, I'm only focusing on that.
Thank you very much. Our second presenter is Sarah Jane Nelson. Sarah Jane is a Davis Center associate. She's an author and musician, and she documents traditional folk music communities in North America. And she's interested in the intersection of myth-making and representation of the immigrant experiences. And the title of Sarah Jane's presentation is Etched in Silver: What an Imperial Artifact Can Tell Us About Russia Abroad. We are thrilled.
Thank you. A Silver Age cigarette case, its exact provenance still unknown, surfaced in an Ohio antique shop. It made the rounds of Russian-themed nightclubs in New York during the height of the McCarthy era, and is filled with over 50 signatures of artists and musicians and dancers and other New York notables who are connected to one another in several ways that I'm still discovering. And so we are looking at a time period that is beyond Mark Raef's Russia Abroad, not beyond the year of 1939. Among the few individuals that I selected, several were born in Ukraine, but identified as Russian throughout their lives. I respond to their life stories contained in an artifact that naturally elicits nostalgia, keeping in mind that there are many uses of this emotion, not all of them benign, as discussed in Lowenthal's book, The Past is a Foreign Country. First and foremost, I ask, how do these individuals use the emotion of nostalgia to connect and contribute to American culture? Begin with Polyakova. Born into a family of Romani singers, Nastya grew up in the shadow of Varya Panina's voice, but soon found her own. She rose as high as her voice could carry her, and when the revolution came, she had to flee as quickly as any white Russian, first to Constantinople, later to Paris, always following her brother. Nastya married a jeweler named Ilya Grinbaum. She fell in love with Paris, but with Hitler advancing, they soon had to leave, one Jewish man and one Romani singer, afraid for their lives. New York adored her, but Nastya did not love New York. Soon widowed, she sang for posterity, sang for President Roosevelt, who likely understood not a word. She died alone without family, having made many men cry, and she died impoverished. Next, Lanya Kabus. The revolution comes even to musical prodigies. Lanya's pianistic prowess saves his family from starvation in Odessa, but just barely. An embassy worker in Bulgaria discovers Lanya's talent, gives him papers, instructions, emigrate at 17, not 19, so as to be with family. In New York, in New Jersey, the gigs flow like wine until the second Red Scare. Lanya makes innumerable records with cigarette case friends. He rears a son, retires to Florida. Boris Sergeyevsky. Tremendous tenor voice, test pilot to Igor Sikorsky, breaker of aviation records, breaker of marriages. Absent father sends money, co-pilots with Charles Lindbergh, but later cuts his fascist ties when he falls in love with Gertrude Hauschild, a Jewish heiress who holds the keys to the Adirondack estate. Gertrude must endure 35 years of ballerinas at her breakfast table. Aris Sergeyevsky, the son of Boris, reared by his grandmother in Kiev. It is winter 1920-21. Quote, "The cold was the worst of the many hardships we had to endure. Granny and I were now alone in a world that had collapsed around us, unquote. After the Civil War, there's a forcibly calm reunion with a distant father in colorful Cartagena. Arist grows into an artist open to all people, experiences. His father balks, brings the family to small town Connecticut, gets a job for his awkward son at the Sikorsky plant. Arist, the dancer, is miserable. His grandmother prevails, and he's released into the Folkeens Dance School on Riverside Drive in Manhattan. Theo Mikhail, Tevye of Fiddler on the Roof. Austrian-born Jew, but never an Austrian. Singer, actor, a Yiddishkeit, a polyglot host to refugees, displaced persons, friend to the Obolenskys, the Galitzins, observed their magical thinking up close, but remained wary, he being a Jew. Russian folk music, his first love, later abandoned, self-censorship on political principle, the Soviet treatment of Jews. Alarmed early on by Netanyahu, a clear-eyed prophet of times to come. Sasha Polanov, born Alexander Polachuk, born in China to Ukrainian parents. His father, a haberdasher turned soldier for the Tsar, is shot by bandits. The young Sasha trudged 6 miles a day through Harbin, delivering stationery while his mother took in laundry. Circuses came through, balalaikas, plagues, Sangari floodwaters. Sasha arrived in Seattle in December of 1923 on a jam-packed ship, the last year before the Johnson-Reed Act slammed the door shut. Sasha finds dancing, music, vaudeville, a talented Jewish wife who's in with the Folkens. They settle in New York, they grow old together, they grow zinnias in Westchester. Sasha drives to evening gigs in Manhattan until he can no longer stay awake behind the wheel. Here we have Sasha plays the Russian, the Cossack, but laughs at himself out loud. Having outlived Russia abroad, having outlived his wife, Sasha is adopted by American folkies who remember his tunes from their parents. Michael Verbov, a student of Ilya Repin, taken in by the master, but quickly cast out due to his verbosity and boastfulness. Undaunted, Verbov makes his way in the world, survives the revolution, climbs the Soviet ladder, paints a portrait of Lenin, and then exits. He makes his way to Paris, to New York. He paints Chaladapin, King Gustav of Sweden, Indira Gandhi, Ivan Bunin, America's founding fathers. He settles in the Hotel des Artistes in New York, where he lives among the comfortable clutter of portraits, books, and chairs, and 2-story windows that look out on Central Park. At the age of 80, he is cast out again, but this time by a young lawyer. Where will I go? He asked the New York Times reporter. That's the hotel in which he lived. And thank you.
I think it was fascinating. Yeah. So we have 2 questions. You have 2. Please.
Just one. What happened to Verbov? You said he was cashed out at 80, but I saw he lived to 100 years old.
I am going to newspapers.com trying to discover the answer to that. I really don't know. I'm trying to figure that out. I really want to know. Yeah. And did he bring all his chairs with him? He had a lot of chairs for people to sit and have their portraits painted. So.
Relatedly, how are you discovering the many lives?
The many lives.
You said newspapers.com. So.
I am reading many books.
Yeah.
And I use my Google Translate because I do not speak any Slavic languages. And I spend all my time doing that, reading. I'm also part of the music community. I hear stories. I hang out with the Balalaika and Domra Association of America. They have stories, people who knew people. So many different avenues. Yeah.
Very short. Natasha, very short
Yeah,
question.
very short. I just want to ask, are you the person who found the cigarette case?
It was on social media. So yes, that's how I discovered that it
So
existed.
not physically yourself at the shop?
No, I was not in Ohio, no. But somebody alerted it. They said Sasha Polinoff is on here, and they knew that I had been studying Sasha's life for some time and gathering oral histories on Sasha's life. I'm still doing that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello. Slava. Slava Geroich is the Davis Center Associate. And he's a historian of Soviet science and technology and the author of several books. And these books were published by MIT Press, by Palgraf Macmillan, and by the University of Pittsburgh Press. And his current project is focused on the parallel social infrastructure of the Soviet mathematics. And the title of his presentation is Mathematics is a Way of Life in the Late Soviet Union. Slava, please.
Great, thank you. I'm grateful for the opportunity to condense 10 years of my research into 7 minutes. Actually, mathematicians like to say that, if you don't understand the topic, you spend time writing a book about it. Once you figure things out, you write a short article. So let's see if it will help. So the period we are dealing with is late 60s, early 70s. The dissident movement, Prague Spring, the Six-Day War, breaking diplomatic relations with Israel, Jewish cultural revival and immigration, a crackdown by the KGB and the party on both groups, the dissidents and the Jews. And this ensues a certain power struggle in Soviet academia. And particularly with respect to the mathematics community, it results in a power shift in the administration of top mathematics departments across the Soviet Union and top research institutions of pure math. This results in a systematic discrimination against these kind of marginalized groups or undesirables, Jews, dissidents, and ironically graduates of math schools, because they seem to overlap very well with the previous two groups. So, and this discrimination concerns the whole spectrum of activities involved in mathematical education and research and publications, and pretty much covering all the bases, slowly or quickly pushing out these marginalized groups out of opportunities in these fields. So if we take as an example just these three winners of the Fields Medal in mathematics, the three Soviet-era Fields medalists. Fields Medal is the top award in mathematics for young mathematicians up to the age of 40, and only 3 people during the Soviet era were awarded that medal. In all 3 of them, in one way or another, suffered from this type of discrimination. The first one signed a protest letter. Then, as a result, he was banned from going to the International Congress where he was supposed to be awarded that medal. So he did not get the medal there. The second, and he eventually had to move out of pure mathematics into a physics institute and works there. That strengthened mathematical physics, but wasn't so good for math. Grigory Margulis, second winner, also he couldn't find a job at a pure math research institution, had to work in an applied math institution. And when he was proclaimed the winner of the Fields Medal, the Soviet authorities did not allow him again to go to the Congress to collect his medal. The third winner was an invited lecturer in 1978, was not allowed to go to Congress. In 1990, when he was actually awarded the medal, there was already different time, so he was allowed to go, but he never got a job in Moscow. So even though he got his degree in Moscow, he had to go to Bashkiria, to University in Ufa, and then he moved back to his home city of Kharkiv, where he worked again at the Physics Institute, not pure math research. So, but the focus of my project is not so much the discrimination per se, but the reaction of the mathematical community to these conditions. What did they do? How did they deal with it? And it seems that they developed a set of very interesting and productive strategies for dealing with these barriers erected before these marginalized groups. They constructed what I call a parallel social infrastructure. That is, they created essentially informal institutions that replaced official institutions and provided opportunities for those undesirables to get college, advanced college education in mathematics, to attend research seminars, to get informal advising, to get employment in alternative niche institutions, to publish their research despite barriers. And they often did that activity not in official institutions, but in private or semi-private settings. And since this activity largely was conducted outside official institutions, it left very little paper trail. So my project is largely focusing on oral history. I've interviewed more than 90 mathematicians and some interesting archival finds in the collections of immigrant mathematicians here in the US. So the topics, the three topics that are underlined, these are topics of my articles that have already been published. I'm finishing an article on People's University, and there are 2 more to go. Speaking of those private spaces, one interesting site for mathematical production was, ironically, the kitchen. And that's where mathematicians say that's the largest table in the house was, and people gathered around it, and if they had to collaborate and work together, and that's where they did mathematics. Actually, here's a quote from, I don't know if you can see it, Robert McPherson, a very famous American mathematician, and Americans really loved this. They did maybe not quite realizing that this was a forced situation, that they had to work at someone's kitchen, not in their office, because people didn't have an office or couldn't bring other people to their office, but they really enjoyed it. Then it's interesting to maybe compare these uses of kitchen with the kind of cultural anthropological studies of uses of these private spaces in the Soviet Union. Another site is a dacha. And again, it's a place where people rented in the summer, gathered together and did mathematics. It wasn't for vacations, really was their workplace. And again, it's interesting to compare how dacha figures in as a cultural symbol and the cultural imagery associated in Soviet daily life. Really, an interesting comparison is Soviet mathematics with post-war American physics. And while physicists in the post-war period moved to suburbs, Soviet mathematicians retreat to apartments and dacha. For physicists, home is a refuge from work. For Soviet mathematicians, it's a primary workspace. Physics as a regular job, mathematics as an unpaid activity. Alienation in the community and community building. Professionalization in the American case, and practicing math as a way of life. Thank you.
Kitchen and Duchess, yeah. So,
That's the title of my article.
Yeah.
Yes.
so questions, please.
Wondering, is there like, so within official institutions, kind of before they had to move to the unofficial ones, is there like a Marxist-Leninist ideologically correct way to do math? Like, is the academic field kind of guided in that way, the same way that history or even some physical sciences were?
Even Stalin did not believe that the Marxist could be a guide to doing mathematics. So he wrote on the margins. He was editing Lysenko's speech, and And when they were talking about bourgeois sciences, he wrote, could mathematics be bourgeois? Ha ha. But Stalin actually did not anticipate what Soviet ideologues actually tried to do. Marx had his kind of notes taken while he tried to take a mathematical course. And those notes were later discovered in archives, later published as mathematical notebooks by Marx. And there were attempts by Soviet philosophers to somehow derive some overarching principles which Soviet mathematicians had to follow. But they discovered that those were not, original philosophical thoughts by Marx. These were just notes he took listening to someone lecturing on math. Wasn't terribly helpful. But still, Soviet mathematicians, when publishing some of the books that had wider leadership, had to provide introductions with ritual mentions of ideological discourse. Yeah.
Misha, thank you.
Well, thank you for your talk. Was there something distinct about mathematicians in the way they organized their life? Were they in the Soviet Union? Were they kind of were they more successful than others, such as, literary critics or, linguists or philosophers in retreating from sort of the public life and then kind of finding a niche for themselves somewhere in the dacha where they wouldn't come in touch with the authorities, with the sort of suppressive regime?
So mathematics has very little overhead. So you need basically pen and paper, and you need to be aware of what other people are doing. And this, so the infrastructure that the community created was sufficient for them to really do world-level mathematics, to produce works that would bring them Fields medals. It's very difficult to do it, say, in physics or in any science that involves working with equipment, with collections. That requires access to official institutions. In mathematics, you could really do it at dacha, but you need a community to support it and circulate your work. But that was feasible. For the humanities, it's a different story. There's mathematics is kind of seen as ideologically neutral, so you could publish things just the way you wrote them. In the humanities, you had to either adapt them to publishable status or publish them abroad, which would get you into trouble. So it was a bit different in a sense, of restrictions imposed on the way you could share your work.
Thank you very much, Kelly. Sorry, no. Yeah, thank you. And now I invite Sarah Hamel. And Sarah is a Dissent Center faculty associate, and she will be.
This is like 6 years old.
Oh, really?
Currently.
It's not really.
No. Yeah, I am currently a lecturer in the government department at Harvard.
Sarah is currently a lecturer in the government.
I need to update this.
Absolutely. But I hope the other that you got the PhD from Princeton.
That is right.
That's right. Department of Politics. And that your research focuses on the internal and external politics of authoritarian countries. Not anymore.
Sometimes, yeah.
Yeah. Central Asia.
Still Central Asia, some Russia.
Central Asia and some Russia, some Russia. Yeah. And the topic, hopefully the topic of the presentation, gender and lawmaking in Russia.
Got it. Okay, well, thank you for this. I'm really excited for this opportunity to talk about some newer research that I'm working on that's about gender and lawmaking in Russia. And so one way that political scientists think about women's representation is as democratic representation. After all, you can't have a democracy when half of the population has no meaningful say in how the government is being run. We also sort of hope that once in office, women in positions of power will stand up for the interests of women and other marginalized groups, that they will improve women's rights, that there will be improvements in human rights and anti-corruption reforms and other kind of beneficial social and economic policies. But Wonder Women aside, we have seen that the expansion of women's representation has co-occurred with a hardening of authoritarianism in the world. And this really challenges the view of female representation as a harbinger of democracy, and has led political scientists to start thinking about female representation as something else, something that we call gender washing. And in this much more pessimistic view, women are given positions of nominal power as a way of boosting the legitimacy of regimes, both in the eyes of other countries and possibly in the eyes of their own citizens. The goal in this case is not to change the status quo, but to maintain it with a more legitimate representative veneer. As a result, we may not see the wonder women that we hope for. Instead, we may see yes women who go along with the lawmaking of the end interests of their male colleagues. Okay, so in my research, I argue that how female deputies behave really depends a lot on who they are. And how do we figure out who they are? Well, in more authoritarian contexts, the kind of women who get into political office depends on what the regime itself values. And so if this is a gender washing story, if we are talking about just legitimizing the regime, what we should see are, women who are more passive actors, who go along with things, right? And so when you compare a woman who is selected from a population to become a candidate for political office or to enter political office, and you compare that to a man who has also gone through the same process, the woman is likely to be a little bit more passive than the man. But this overlooks a critical step, and that is the one that comes before this. Before a woman is selected to take political office, she has to decide that she wants to be a candidate. She has to, in effect, throw her hat into the ring. And we know from a lot of research in Western democracies that that is a gendered decision as well. Women face higher barriers to candidacy. This is institutional. There is a weaker pipeline to power for women than there is for men. This is cultural. Women usually have familial duties and responsibilities that men don't have and that trade off against taking political office. And this is also psychological. When we look at women, many of them will be less confident in their own abilities than men who have the same qualifications. Women are also, on average, more competition or conflict averse. They tend to avoid conflictual situations. And guess what's conflictual? Going into politics, right? And so as a result, what we see is, and it's hard to see, but my sort of yellow people are my people who would like to go into politics. We have less of them that are women, right? And in addition, the type is going to be different. They are going to look more different from the average woman than a male candidate will look from the average man in particular ways. And it turns out that once these women get into political office, their confidence, their diligence, their conflict exceptions, which are sort of exceptional characteristics for them as women, they don't just disappear, right? Quite the opposite. These personal attributes should rub up against any expectations that they will be passive actors. So what is the net effect of these competing pressures? To answer this question, I look at the Russian State Duma. And the first thing I look at is the contentiousness of female behavior once they get into the Duma. Now, when I say contentiousness, you might be thinking about fistfights in parliament. I'm talking about something a lot more boring, and that is voting, okay? But in a context where voting against legislation is not terribly normal, when the norm is to kind of go along with things, voting no is a contentious legislative strategy. And we should expect that if women are passive actors, they're not going to rock the boat by voting no. But when we look at the data, what we see is that female deputies vote no at a somewhat higher rate than men do. They are not just always saying yes. The next thing I look at is legislative effectiveness, whether they are actively and effectively engaged in lawmaking. Under the gender washing story, we shouldn't see them doing a whole lot of lawmaking. We should just see them nodding along with what the men are doing, right? Let alone lawmaking that gets signed into law. But what we see when we look at the data is that they actually do that. In particular, they are more effective legislators in the sense that more bills that women sponsor are actually going to make it into being law than the sort of bills that men are sponsoring. They're sort of more likely to get their bills signed into law. And then finally, I look at what these bills are about, the legislative focus. In line with the Wonder Woman story, they dedicate most of their more of their legislative focus to things that are sort of traditionally considered women's issues, and less to the traditional male domains of security and defense policy. They are, it seems, representing the interests of women in particular. And so when I put all of this together, I have to conclude that female deputies in the State Duma are not passive actors. But this doesn't necessarily mean that female representation will advance the causes of liberal democracy. Because the truth is that the strong, confident, conflict-acceptant women who have self-selected into candidacy, they just not want to do that. Women, like men, have a big range of opinions, and the state still has a lot of say over whose opinions are going to get represented in an institution like the State Duma. And so we end up with deputies like Yelena Mizulina, who chaired the Committee on Family, Women, and Children's Affairs for 4 years and fits very much the profile that I have sort of painted here. She sponsored or co-sponsored 66 bills, had 18 of them signed into law, which is pretty active. Many of them were on issues of women and family. But she did not advance a liberal agenda. She wanted to limit abortion access. She wanted to condemn divorce and children being born out of wedlock. She wanted to condemn in the strongest possible ways homosexuality. She even in later years sponsored legislation to decriminalize spousal and child abuse. So this is not an advancement for women's rights. And this is where I want to take the project next. I want to explore the question of when do the gendered barriers to candidacy that result in these strong female deputies actually make the prospects for democracy and gender rights worse. Thank you.
We have our two questions. We have our.
Well, thanks very much, especially for the brawling pictures. My question is quick. Does your data allow you to draw conclusions on whether women legislators are more prone to corruption than the boys are?
Okay, that's a good question. I don't have that data, but I think it does exist, and it is something that I could look into.
Thank you.
Mine is very simple, I'll say.
Please.
How many women are in the Duma currently-ish?
It's about, over this time period, it's an average of like 10 to 15% of the Duma.
We don't count as a question.
I had a question in my research, which has been in Oblast Dumas at the regional level. Not as many, much lower stakes. I found a lot of people who were in leadership positions, either sometimes as chair of the Duma or like ZAM, were people who had developed careers where there was usually a man who was kind of a local sort of bigwig who kind of made his way up, and there was a woman or maybe more than one who would be kind of deputies, and then they would be sort of, now I've gotten to be governor of the region, so I'm going to put you in, as opposed to someone who, initially was like, I think I would like to be in politics. And they might have even come from the person worked in like an enterprise or something, and they just kind of follow that man along. Is that ever the case with people in the Duma that you found?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that dynamic happens everywhere, and that's what we would call this kind of gendered pipeline to power, right? This idea that it is different, how easy it is to get there in the end, and sort of what the process is by which you get there in the end. And we know that it looks different for men and women, both kind of in the United States, but also in Russia. And so I think the argument would be that you're still looking down. You're still looking, even if you don't have to really fight that hard to get your seat, you are still looking at engaging in politics in Russia. And that is not for the sort of the faint of heart. And so the women who are sort of okay with that are still going to be kind of fundamentally different than women who would respectfully decline.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Now we are with the paranormal.
Closer to math than you might think.
So I love to introduce Emma Friedlander. Emma is a Data Center graduate student associate. She entered, it's not 4 or 5 years, no, it's like, you entered the history PhD program at Harvard University in 2020, right?
Yeah, that's still true.
Good, yeah. And she's doing the project that examines popular culture of alternative spirituality, alternative healing, and the paranormal that swept late Soviet and post-Soviet society. And she has many cases, many country cases, including Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Moldova, Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. And you see the title, the popular paramount, a symbol of Soviet collapse. Please.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much to the Davis Center for putting on this great event and for all of the other speakers. It's been so interesting to hear all of your talks. So in the peak years of Soviet collapse from around the late 80s into the early 90s, a craze for the paranormal really took over popular culture. Horoscopes filled newspaper pages ranging from Pravda to these new cheap tabloids that seem to be sprouting up every day. Poltergeists and UFO sightings were also everyday local sensations. We have one over Yalta that was cited. And people were consumed with prophecies about imminent world collapse. Psychics reigned supreme, whether in these new private medical cooperatives, in mass auditoria, or reaching hundreds of millions of people through the television, or celebrity psychics like Anatoly Kashpirovsky, top left, charged jars of water, or I guess pickles if you want to, viewers would place in front of their television sets and would then be charged with healing properties through the television. Just to give a sense of how commonplace this was in the middle here, this is just called Donetsk News from 1992, kind of just like a normal newspaper. But above the fold, listing the most important contents within include gossip about Kashpirovsky, psychics' advice on how to avoid illness, and of course, President Kravchuk's horoscope. So my dissertation explores this larger explosion of paranormal and alternative spirituality onto the cultural mainstream in the Soviet Union from the late 70s into the early 2000s. But this period and late perestroika and into the early 90s was really the peak. And as mentioned, this was the case across many of the former Soviet republics. I only look at the Western ones in my project in order to have some geographical limits, but I believe it would extend even beyond that. But why and how did the paranormal become such a central part of culture? And there are a few different understandings of this, both by myself and other scholars who have looked at this, that are all true to some extent. So you have just the opening of the floodgates, right? Censorship is largely gone, which also explains why this intermingles with pornography so much. I chose not to show you pictures of that, but as you go through press sources from the time, it's really amazing how much these topics, this along with, sorry about that, we'll go into that next. It's not even that they're on the same page, but are actually like the same content at the same time. So, right, it's just this lack of censorship, complete openness. But also a lot of scholars will tell you, which is true, that this is not necessarily new to the Soviet Union at this period. You have this earlier Cold War development of science and publications about science in the Soviet Union. So perhaps not mathematicians, but other scientists actually have an embrace of exploring different possibilities really from the 50s onwards, as well as late socialist milieus of mystical experimentation and dropping out of socialism for more kind of privileged groups in society. We may also see this as a spiritual vacuum between the fall or disillusionment with scientific atheism and dialectical materialism, but also with the legacy of religious repression in the Soviet Union that might make a lot of people land somewhere in between. But I also think that the cultural emphasis on the paranormal at this time was about more than the paranormal. The heavy symbolism of this period, or of this trend during this period, that the world was ending, that an ideological vacuum was emerging, and that new realities were rushing to fill it, was not lost on contemporary observers. Even then, it was understood to represent a much larger chaos, a much larger systemic, societal, economic, political, and ideological collapse and uncertainty. So as an illustration of this, in the early 1990s, Latvia, which is currently at this time going through its own process of independence and setting up a new society, their Ministry of Health pioneers the attempt to put limits on psychics who are doing like healing in mass auditoria. They don't outlaw it completely, but they try to put some limitations where you have to get a certificate to do it. This became a very heated topic in the press. When making the decision, the Minister of Health of Latvia said in 1990, so currently, you know, independence is in motion. He said, "This situation shows just how rotten our society is." As the country strove to establish its independence, he was concerned that culture in Latvia was being dominated by flying saucers, psychics, and people who were waiting for the end of the world, and that this would affect the country's ability to have stability and to have a good international reputation. And this is a sentiment that is described not only in Latvia at the time, you see a very similar sentiment being echoed among all of these different former republics creating their independence at the time. And at the same time in Latvia, around 1992, a conservative Latvian politician attested that the incessant craze for the paranormal merely represented this larger liberal immortality and chaos that would thwart the country's ability to successfully transition into independence and self-sufficiency. But elsewhere, journalists and their reports also reflected largely this idea that this was a reflection of hunger and poverty for a lot of people as well. Just to give you one anecdote about that, in 1992, the newspaper Argumenti I Fakti, which was really like the pioneer of this new tabloid media at this time, had journalists go to the Arbat in Moscow, and they said, "We can do better analysis for you than academics can. We're going to write these little songs or poems that represent the mood of the population at the time." And one of the ones that they include says, "Kashpirovsky, you can do anything. Please help us. Each day food is getting more expensive and our bellies are talking." So kind of in this attempt to distill, they notice this connection between this chaotic culture and the real hunger and poverty that people are experiencing. But still for others, this prominence of the irrational spoke to the need to rebuild society more. So one journalist in 1991 in Russia said that the sorcerer's hour is twilight, right? That this reigns supreme in times of collapse and transition. But he was hopeful that eventually we will reawaken society, put an end to the passion for sorcerers, which is shameful for civilized society. And those forecasts that things would stabilize largely proved true. So while esoteric interests remain present throughout this region and in the United States as well, just their intensity of this like really intense culture at the time definitely started to subside a bit from around the mid-90s onwards as, you know, more stability was gained. But I guess as a parting thought, as perhaps we are entering a new era of instability and uncertainty and change, we can wonder perhaps whether a different version of this might rear its head again. As a final suggestion, in the early days of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, media across the region saw a kind of growing presence of astrologers giving analysis about the events on television, of prophecies from Baba Vanga, who's like a Bulgarian 80s prophecy giver, I suppose. So kind of the return of that culture, more UFO sightings, which we've had in the United States as well. And Kashpirovsky is currently on a live mass seance tour in Russia, which he had not done for many years. So in some ways, we might see another time of this culture emerging. Thank you.
You know, with your focus of your research. I remember these times. Very, very well. Now I remember it even better because of your presentation. It was not an instant, it was hysteric. The whole society was hysteric about these things. It was terrible to see, really, it was very, very strange times. I also remember Alan Chumak.
Yes.
You know, who did